When we talk about the saints, we are frequently talking about those who have been through the rigorous formal process of becoming canonized saints. However, the communion of saints is the spiritual union of us all, living and dead, who attempt to live our lives modeled after the Prince of Peace. Some would argue that even those outside the Christian faith have been exemplary models of how we might live as Jesus lived, and therefore they too can be our holy heroes who have the light of God shine through them. I've grown to love the communion of saints and find it beautiful that they are our brothers and sisters. So now I'm going to share with you a few of my favorites. Dorothy Day has had her cause for sainthood started. I really love Dorothy because she is a modern day saint for justice. While she died before you were born, she overlapped with my life, and I have friends who knew her personally. She was a fiery, powerful woman who started out as a socialist and hung out with a lot of atheists. But she kept feeling a tug from God, and she admired the Catholic Church because she saw the Church was an ardent defendant of the poor and masses, and she recognized that the poor found a home in Catholicism. I love that she believed deeply in both charity and justice. She offered radical hospitality to the homeless and to others. She started the Catholic worker movement, and it was common for the Catholic worker to be ready and willing to spend their very last penny in care for the poor, and not know where the money to pay the next bill would come from, only to have those needs met by the generosity of others. She was also radically nonviolent and resisted war and violence of every kind, and she was willing to risk arrest for that conviction. The next is Julius Nyerere. His cause for sainthood has also been started. He lived not far from where I went to language school in Tanzania. He was the first president of independent Tanzania and was educated by some of the Maryknoll priests that I've known there. Julius went to daily mass and let that influence his leadership of Tanzania. Nyerere instituted an African form of socialism called Ujamaa, which meant familyhood. While some might consider the economic model instituted by Nyerere to be a failure, he led one of the most remarkably unified, peaceful countries on the African continent. He was called upon to negotiate peace in conflicts of other nations and is considered one of the great modern patriarchs of the entire continent. All that being inspired by his Catholic faith has helped propel his cause for sainthood. I actually had the opportunity to meet his wife. She was the first lady for the first president of Tanzania, kind of the equivalent to our Martha Washington. She lived a humble life, and as we pulled up to her modest home in the country, she came walking out of the large garden, shovel in hand, having spent hours with the earth. Real, authentic Christian simplicity. Another one of my favorite saints is St. Martin of Tours. I'm a firm believer in the power of nonviolence, and I love St. Martin of Tours because he is a luminary of nonviolence, but also a pretty typical Christian of his era in his commitment to nonviolence. The first 300 years of the Church was deeply committed to nonviolence and did not change until the Church cozied up to empire in the time of Constantine. Anyway, St. Martin had joined the army at the age of 15 and became a Christian at the age of 18, and at that point recognized that that involved refusing to participate in any form of violence. He is famous for, upon meeting a beggar and having nothing else to give, cutting in half his heavy and costly military cloak to give to the beggar for clothes. St. Martin refused to fight in battle, but was courageously willing to be sent to the front lines without a weapon, even though that particular battle ended up never taking place. He was later released from the army and continues to be the patron saint of conscientious objectors. A saint that I'm sure many of you are aware of is St. Francis of Assisi. Pope Francis takes his name from Francis of Assisi. He deserves credit for being deeply committed to the environment and all living creatures, and for that reason, he is such a saint for our era. That said, I think the whole St. Francis of the Birdbath image of him talking to the animals is a bit tired and makes him easily dismissed as flaky. However, St. Francis lived radical simplicity and radical nonviolence. An increasingly famous story, Francis and the Sultan is my favorite story. Francis, who hated violence, did not agree with the Crusades, and during the Fifth Crusade, he crossed the battlefield unarmed and was beaten and brought before Sultan Malik al-Kamil. He and the Sultan met for days, talked about God, and grew in love and appreciation for one another. Neither were converted in a religious kind of way, but in their growing respect for one another and each other's faith tradition. They model interreligious dialogue, and Francis models the power of nonviolence. Oscar Romero is one of our most recent saints, just beatified in recent years. Romero is a hero of someone who stepped outside of his comfort zones. When chosen as a bishop of El Salvador, he was considered a safe pick, a quiet bureaucrat who was too cowardly and stuffy to ruffle any feathers. It was simply expected that he would allow the rich and powerful to continue in their ways. However, he went with his friend, Jesuit Father Rutilio Grande, to the villages, and in meeting the people, he allowed himself to be converted by them and their story of suffering and oppression. After Rutilio Grande was murdered by the government, Romero picked up where Father Grande had left off and spoke up on behalf of the poor. Romero was killed while celebrating Mass by an oppressive government. I love Romero's courage, humility, and willingness to change and grow through his encounters with the poor. Thomas Merton, along with Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., and Abraham Lincoln, is one of the 4 notable Americans of faith that Pope Francis highlighted when he spoke to the U.S. Congress a few years back. Thomas Merton led a pretty wild life up until his 20s, when his spiritual seeking led him to join the Trappist monastery in Kentucky. The Trappists lived pretty intense lives of solitude, prayer, work, and silence, and yet his Trappist superiors called upon him to use his gifts of writing, and he became one of the most famous and prolific spiritual writers of the 20th century. His writing covered not only the spiritual journey, but also what that spiritual journey calls us to regarding war, racism, and interreligious dialogue. Merton ended up engaging and finding common ground between Christianity and Eastern religions. In these ways, he is a tremendous model of using our gifts to work for understanding of other religions and to combat racism and war. I'd like to close with the 4 American churchwomen martyrs: Maryknoll sisters Maura Clark, Ida Ford, lay missioner Jean Donovan, and Sister Dorothy Kazel. Since 3 of these women were with Maryknoll, the same organization that my family spent 7 years in Kenya with, I feel a special connection to them and call upon their spirit for support. All these women worked with the poor of El Salvador, doing essential ministries of education and healthcare. They walked with and among the poor, sharing their lives and learning from them. As violence intensified in El Salvador, they knew the risks. All 4 were murdered by the U.S.-backed Salvadoran military because they took the side of the poor and oppressed in El Salvador. Maryknoll's sister, Ida Ford, wrote the following beautiful words to her 16-year-old niece in the months leading up to her death. I think they are valuable words for you as you near the end of high school. She says, I hope you come to find that which gives life deep meaning for you, something worth living for, maybe even worth dying for, something that energizes you, enthuses you, enables you to keep moving ahead. I can't tell you what it will be. That's for you to find, to choose, to love. I can just encourage you to start looking and support you in that search.